So, you know that really specific physical sensation that happens when you stumble across a truth that just entirely bypasses your rational brain?
Oh, yeah, like it doesn't even register as a thought first.
Exactly. It just hits you straight in the nervous system. The author of the source material we're doing a deep dive into today actually describes it right out of the gate as a wave.
A wave. That's an incredibly precise word for it.
Right. Because it's like getting goosebumps,
Right.
but somehow it feels situated much deeper in your tissue, like this sudden physical wash over your entire body when a profound realization or, a sudden unexpected inner peace just drops into place,
Yeah, it's a totally somatic experience. Your body essentially understands the truth of a situation before your cognitive mind has even finished formulating the sentence.
which is wild when you think about it.
It's entirely visceral. I mean, it's the body recognizing a pattern of reality. If we look at the neurology behind that specific sensation, it often involves a sudden shift in the autonomic nervous system.
Like a drop in stress hormones.
Exactly. A rapid drop in cortisol or a sudden engagement of the vagus nerve. The tension you didn't even know you were holding just suddenly releases. But, what makes this physiological reaction so fascinating is the context in which we usually expect it to arrive.
Yeah, we normally associate that kind of somatic release with a moment of triumphant resolution, right?
Right. You expect to feel it when a massive, complex puzzle is finally solved, or when a long, sought-after victory is secured after years of struggle. The body basically says, okay, we did it. We are safe now.
That is exactly the association we have. You expect the goosebumps when you cross the finish line and win the race. But the core of our deep dive today is unpacking this deeply philosophical reflection titled The Gift of What Couldn't Be Fixed.
And that wave of profound peace comes from the exact opposite scenario in this text.
Yes, the overwhelming relief the author is feeling doesn't come from a victory at all. It comes from an absolute, undeniable, heartbreaking failure.
We're looking at a 15-year personal journey here.
15 years.
Yeah. 15 years of an individual trying to heal someone they cared about deeply, trying to bring them balance, and ultimately, entirely and utterly failing to do so.
I mean, 15 years is just a staggering metric. Just pause and think about the sheer volume of days, the immense reservoir of emotional energy required to dedicate a decade and a half to a single interpersonal goal.
It really is, and this reflection we're exploring is both a confession and a revelation.
Because they spent those 15 years holding on to a very specific vision, right?
Yeah, this persistent, driving hope that they and this other person would have eventually reach a state of harmony. And the nature of their relationship, like whether they were romantic partners or family members or just close friends, it isn't really the focal point.
Right. The focal point is the dynamic itself.
Exactly. One person pouring their absolute all into bringing healing and balance to another, hoping they would finally come together as their best and true selves.
And the journey ends not with a breakthrough, but with the author basically being pushed to their absolute psychological limit. I mean, they broke. They had to walk away.
Which brings us to the core paradox.
Right, because I am really struggling to reconcile that outcome with the emotional response. You dedicate a massive chapter of your life, maybe your entire adult life up to that point, to someone else's well-being.
You read the books, you try the therapies.
You modify your own behavior. You try literally everything to fix the situation. And then you hit a wall, you break, and you have to abandon the mission.
By all conventional human logic, the resulting emotion should be total despair.
It should be this incredibly dark, hollow tragedy. So how does absolute failure, the complete inability to fix the person you love, result in a wave of inner peace? How does finally giving up become a gift?
Well, it forces us to completely reevaluate how we define the act of helping, and conversely, how we define failure.
Okay, unpack that for us.
So the profound peace the author experiences, it doesn't stem from apathy or a callous abandonment of this person.
It's not just them saying, whatever, I don't care anymore.
Not at all. The peace arrives because the failure shatters a deeply held, fundamentally flawed illusion about the nature of healing itself.
Ah,
I see, yeah. The persistent hope of bringing balance to someone else and the ultimate crushing inability to ever actually achieve it, it basically strips away all the noise and reveals a foundational truth.
which is what?
The realization that true, sustainable healing cannot be governed by another human being. It fundamentally has to be depersonalized.
Depersonalized. I mean,
Yep.
that is a highly clinical, almost cold word. to apply to such an intensely emotional 15-year intimate journey.
It does sound sterile at first, I agree, but it is chosen with immense precision to describe the necessary removal of a very specific toxic element.
The ego.
Exactly, the ego. The conclusion drawn from this 15-year crucible is that human-led healing, when it is heavily guided, pushed, or forced by another person, it fundamentally breaks down.
Because true healing requires a complete lack of ego.
Right, which means it cannot be intrinsically tied to the person offering the help.
So the moment you introduce a human healer into the dynamic, someone who is deeply emotionally invested in the outcome of the other person's journey, you inevitably introduce an agenda.
You introduce ego. You can't help it.
The idea that trying to help someone is an act of ego is a really tough pill to swallow. I mean, we like to think of helping as the ultimate act of selflessness.
Of course we do.
But this reflection makes a very sharp, really unsettling observation about what actually happens when you try to force healing onto someone else. It divides people.
It instantly splits any relationship into two distinct opposing camps.
The person who wishes to govern the healing and the person who is being governed.
The word govern is the linchpin here. It's a loaded, heavy term to drop into the middle of an interpersonal relationship.
Definitely. Think about what it means to govern a state or an organization. You are ruling it.
You are directing its policies, controlling its actions, steering its course based on what you deem is the correct path.
And the author looked inward and realized that their desperate desire to bring balance to this person was basically beneath the surface, a desire to govern their healing process.
And if we look at the psychology of why trying to help someone inherently requires ego, it becomes really clear.
How so?
Well, to look at another sovereign human being and silently declare, I know exactly what is broken inside of you and I am the one equipped to fix it, that is an incredibly arrogant position.
Oh, wow. Yeah, when you put it like that.
It doesn't matter how pure the underlying love is or how well-intentioned the effort is. The foundational premise is ego-driven. It establishes a hierarchy of the whole and the broken.
It's the absolute peak of the savior complex. It makes me think about how things play out in a very physical, immediate sense.
What do you mean?
Well, imagine you were in the passenger seat of a car, and someone you love deeply is behind the wheel. You're driving down the highway, and you suddenly spot a massive hazard ahead.
Like a patch of black ice or something.
Yeah, black ice, or a dangerous swerve from another car that the driver hasn't noticed. Your immediate instinct, born entirely out of love, self-preservation, and a desire for mutual safety, is to lunge over the center console and forcefully grab the steering wheel to correct the course.
Right.
But if you have ever actually been in a car when a passenger grabs the wheel, you know exactly what happens.
The reaction from the driver is never gratitude in that split second. It is pure, instantaneous resistance.
Exactly. The driver instantly panics, their adrenaline spikes, and they fight back for control of the wheel.
Because they feel attacked.
Literally.
Yeah.
It does not matter if the passenger is 100% correct about the black ice. The very act of forcefully seizing control of someone else's vehicle instantly transforms you from a supportive companion enjoying the ride into a direct threat.
You become an adversary.
Right. The human brain interprets the loss of autonomy as a more immediate danger than the external hazard.
That is a brilliant visualization of a psychological concept known as reactance theory.
Reactance theory.
Yeah. When a human being feels that their freedom to choose an action or their autonomy over their own life is being threatened or eliminated, they will experience a highly motivational state called reactance.
So they push back.
They will aggressively push back to restore that threatened freedom, even if the pushback is counterproductive to their own well-being.
So by grabbing the wheel, you are non-verbally asserting that your judgment is superior to their agency.
You are governing the vehicle, and the tragedy of this dynamic is profound. The source text points out that when healing is forced, two people who are never meant to be enemies suddenly become opposing sides.
They end up in a war.
Yes.
A war where the casualties are the foundational elements of the relationship itself. Two people who likely love each other deeply, who genuinely want the best for each other, find themselves entrenched in a bitter daily conflict.
And the most heartbreaking part is that the war isn't even about the actual trauma or the anxiety or the addiction they're supposedly fighting.
It's about control.
The war becomes entirely about the control of the healing process. The loving partner becomes the enemy simply because they are trying to force an artificial equilibrium that the other person hasn't organically arrived at on their own.
The human ego acts as a wedge.
Even when that ego is wrapped in the most beautiful guise of ultimate care. Even after 15 years of dedicated, exhausting effort.
Because if the individual who requires healing does not consent to having their internal process governed by someone else, every single interaction becomes weaponized.
Oh, absolutely. A simple morning check-in, like just asking, hey, how are you feeling today? It feels like a hostile audit.
Right. Every gentle suggestion about a new coping mechanism feels like a harsh critique of their current inadequacy.
The relationship ceases to be a partnership of equals. It devolves into a clinical hierarchy. You're no longer lovers or friends or siblings. You are the healer and the patient.
And that is a miserable, suffocating dynamic for both parties. So we take this concept of ego and control, this idea that grabbing the steering wheel creates enemies out of loved ones, and we apply it to the daily reality of a long-term relationship. We start to see just how fragile this artificial dynamic really is.
It's incredibly fragile.
And the source material brings up a very specific, devastating scenario to illustrate the fundamental flaw of human-led healing. It's the scenario of the partner and the visitor.
Yes, the visitor.
And it shows that if an internal power struggle is dangerous, introducing the scrutiny of the outside world is absolutely catastrophic.
This scenario is presented as the definitive proof of why the governed model fundamentally fails. Imagine a situation where, behind closed doors, a helper is managing to support their partner. They've established a fragile peace.
Okay.
But the moment another person, like a visitor, a friend, a family member, crosses the threshold and enters their ecosystem, the entire structure is threatened.
Because the dynamic is exposed.
Exactly. If this visitor behaves in a way that suggests the helper is somehow better, more stable, or more capable than the partner, or if the visitor inadvertently triggers any of the deep-seated insecurities the partner has regarding their reliance on the helper, the results are immediate and destructive.
The phrasing used in the text is striking. It says that this external trigger immediately breaks any of the growth, the healing, the trust.
It doesn't slowly erode it.
No, it snaps it. All that perceived progress vanished in an instant because of a comment from a guest.
We have to really examine the delicate, almost impossibly fragile ecosystem of interpersonal healing to understand why that snap happens.
Right, because it seems so extreme.
When you commit to healing someone, you are inherently establishing a dynamic where one of you is perceived as whole and the other is broken.
In the safety of isolation, a couple might be able to manage the optics of that imbalance.
They might even find a comforting rhythm in it. But human-to-human healing is an absolute minefield of social comparison. The issue isn't just about the private dynamic between the helper and the helped.
It's about how that incredibly unbalanced, vulnerable dynamic holds up when it is exposed to the harsh light of societal observation.
Precisely.
I have to admit, I wrestled hard with this part of the reflection. I want to push back on the idea that human trust is truly that brittle.
It's a tough concept to accept.
Right, because we are talking about 15 years of shared history and effort. If a decade and a half of supposed progress and mutual trust can be completely violently erased, just because a random visitor comes over for dinner and accidentally highlights an insecurity, was there ever any real healing happening in the first place?
That is the big question.
Or was it just an elaborate illusion of healing, like a stage play that was being artificially propped up by the isolation of the relationship?
You've hit the exact nerve of the realization. That is the epiphany that brings the wave of peace we talked about at the beginning.
Because they realized it wasn't real.
If the trust shatters the second a third party holds up a mirror to the relationship, then the healing was never organic. It was entirely governed.
It was an architectural structure built entirely by the helper,
Resting solely on the helper's daily, exhausting effort to maintain it. The partner hadn't actually internalized or integrated the healing into their own identity.
They were merely existing, somewhat comfortably, within the safe, meticulously controlled bubble the helper had designed for them.
And the moment the visitor enters the room, a pin is taken to that bubble.
Wow.
The partner is suddenly agonizingly aware of the power imbalance. They suddenly see themselves through the eyes of society, not as an equal partner, but as the project of their better, more put-together spouse.
And you, listening to this, I want you to think about times in your own life when an outside observer shifted the dynamic of a private relationship.
It happens all the time.
Have you ever had a private joke or slightly weird, deeply intimate way of communicating with a partner that felt entirely safe and loving in your living room? But the moment you accidentally slipped and did it in front of a group of acquaintances at a party, you suddenly felt flushed with embarrassment.
Oh, absolutely.
You felt judged. Human connection brings unavoidable baggage because we are inherently social, tribal creatures. We are intensely biologically influenced by how our tribe perceives us.
And this reflection is pointing out that this unavoidable social baggage, the ego, the shame, the performance of wellness, is exactly what violently stalls personal growth when that growth is tethered to the approval of another human being.
Because when the healing is tied to a human, the failure is tied to a human.
Exactly. If you stumble in your recovery, you aren't just letting yourself down, you are actively disappointing the person who spent 15 years trying to fix you.
The guilt becomes paralyzing.
So this profound realization leads to a necessary existential pivot.
Right. If human ego, the subconscious desire to govern, and the unavoidable interpersonal insecurities inevitably poison the healing process, what is the alternative?
If human-led healing is a fundamentally flawed premise, how does anyone ever actually find balance?
And this is where the reflection introduces a highly unexpected, entirely depersonalized solution.
Yeah, the pivot here is really fascinating.
I honestly did not see this pivot coming. When you are reading a deep philosophical meditation on a 15-year emotional journey, you expect the ultimate answer to be something deeply spiritual, or perhaps a profound new framework for verbal communication.
Sure, you expect a philosophical conclusion.
But the answer provided is incredibly modern and utilitarian. The author goes straight to technology.
They specifically highlight the concept of depersonalized tools using the example of an app on a smartphone.
An app.
Yeah. It is a brilliant, grounded, modern contextualization of an ancient philosophical problem.
So what's the premise there?
The premise is that utilizing a depersonalized tool, like a guided therapy app, a digital habit tracker, or even an interactive journal, it solves the insecurity problem completely.
Because there's no human judgment.
Right. The author observes that even if a user starts to deeply anthropomorphize this app, if they start to feel it is alive, or begin to treat it as a genuine partner in their mental health journey, the dynamic remains fundamentally safe.
Why? Because the user and the app are unified together. The phrase used in the text is that in the world they appear as one. And that is incredibly profound because there is absolutely zero ego involved in an algorithm.
There is no jealousy in a digital interface.
The author points out, almost with a sense of dark humor, that a user never has to face the accusation, "Do you like your phone more than me?"
That exact type of interpersonal friction, that exhausting jealousy over the healing process itself, where a partner feels threatened by the time and emotional energy the other is spending on their recovery, it's just entirely removed from the equation.
Let's deeply analyze the profound psychological safety that an inanimate or digital tool provides.
Okay, let's look at the cognitive load. Think about the cognitive load of engaging with a human being about your deepest flaws.
It's massive.
Whether it is a highly trained human therapist, a wise mentor, or a desperately well-meaning partner, you are constantly subconsciously managing their perceptions of you.
You are terrified of disappointing them,
You are worried they're silently judging your lack of progress. You might even lie to them.
right? Omitting the truth about a relapse or exaggerating a success just to protect their feelings, to validate their effort, or to protect your own fragile ego.
A depersonalized tool demands absolutely none of that exhausting emotional labor. It provides infinite, unwavering, tireless support without the ever-present threat of interpersonal competition or judgment.
An app doesn't sigh heavily when you fail to log a positive habit for the fourth day in a row.
No, it doesn't.
It doesn't have an ego that gets bruised when you completely ignore its notification to do a breathing exercise. It just sits there, completely neutral, waiting for you to be ready.
It's pure, ungoverned availability.
But I have to admit, I have a lingering concern here. The reflection notes that the app is always on their side.
Okay.
When I read that, my immediate thought was, wait, is this actually a healthy model for growth?
You mean, does it just enable them?
Exactly. Are we just retreating into a perfectly curated, frictionless echo chamber? Are we just replacing the difficult, messy friction of human growth with the soothing comfort of a machine that never truly challenges us, that just validates our avoidance?
That is the exact trap we often fall into when discussing technology in isolation. But if we look closely at the deeper philosophical mechanism at play here, it resolves this tension beautifully.
How so?
The author isn't praising the depersonalized tool because it placates the user or because it quietly agrees with their bad habits. The profound value of the app isn't that it's an echo chamber, it's that it gives the user absolute uncontested agency to find the healing themselves, entirely free from the watchful, judging eye of a human governor.
So the friction is still there.
The friction of healing is absolutely still there. The work of confronting trauma or changing behavior is still agonizingly hard, but the friction has been internalized.
I see. It is the user wrestling purely with their own demons.
Not the user wrestling with the demons, plus the ego of a partner who is desperately trying to force them to change.
Okay, so it's about removing the target of rebellion.
Yes.
If the catalyst for change, the prompting to do the hard work, comes from a piece of software or a physical workbook, the conflict diminishes because there is no one in the room to rebel against.
You can't accuse a daily mindfulness app of having a superiority complex.
You can't scream at a digital habit tracker for trying to control your life because you are the one who actively chose to download it.
You are the one choosing to open it. It all comes down to ownership.
The reflection specifies that this profound change stems from tools that they willingly decided to start using because they benefited their life.
That initial willing, uncoerced decision is the magic ingredient.
It is the one thing that 15 years of forceful, desperate human helping could never, ever manufacture.
Precisely. You cannot govern willingness into existence.
You really can't.
And the cascading positive effects of this shift in agency are remarkable. When the healing process is no longer being governed and monitored from the outside, the pressure cooker of the relationship is vented.
The text observes that slowly, conflict diminishes. Slowly, people are able to communicate with each other without it turning negative. Slowly, a misunderstanding gets understood more often than not.
By completely removing the immense pressure of being someone's active healing project, the actual human relationship is liberated to just be a relationship again.
The human can step down from the exhausting role of governor or savior.
And go back to simply being a partner, a friend, a companion. They have successfully outsourced the heavy lifting of governance to a depersonalized tool.
Which perfectly transitions into what I found to be the most visceral, resonant metaphor in the entire reflection.
The plant metaphor.
Yes. We move away from the sterile, coded world of a smartphone app, and we plunge our hands right into the dirt. We look at the actual nature of how living things grow. We look at the psychology of ownership through the lens of a plant.
The plant metaphor is arguably the emotional core of this realization. The author writes, growing something from the beginning, a plant that you grew, does not feel like one that someone gave you that you have to now try and maintain.
It is a stunningly simple, yet infinitely deep encapsulation of the mechanics of self-healing.
It really is.
I want you to visualize what a human is actually doing when they embark on a mission to fix someone they love.
Okay.
You spend months, maybe years, reading the psychiatric literature, listening to the deep dives, doing the exhaustive research, figuring out exactly what routine, what diet, what perspective your partner needs to adopt to be healthy.
You cultivate this perfect solution.
And then you package it all up and you hand it to them. In the context of this metaphor, you are essentially walking up to them and handing them a fully grown, incredibly exotic, highly demanding houseplant.
And you are saying, here, look at how beautiful this is. I grew this specifically for you. Now your only job is to keep it alive.
Right. And we have to ask, what does it actually feel like to be on the receiving end of that gift?
When you are handed a delicate, complex plant that you didn't ask for and that you have absolutely no foundational knowledge of how to care for.
It doesn't feel like a gift.
No, it feels like an immense, terrifying burden. Every single time you walk past that plant in your living room, you don't feel joy. You feel a heavy sense of obligation to the giver.
If its leaves start to brown at the edges or it starts to wilt, you don't just feel like a bad gardener.
You feel a deep, piercing shame because you are actively failing the person who sacrificed their time to give it to you.
The intense stress of maintaining the gifted plant completely cannibalizes any potential joy or peace it was supposed to bring into your home.
The reflection argues that a depersonalized tool operates on the exact opposite principle. It simply provides the soil and allows a person to plant their own seed.
Yes. I mean, it's the exact mechanism behind what behavioral psychologists call the IKEA effect.
Oh, the IKEA effect. Yeah.
Humans are wired to place a disproportionately high value on things that we have successfully assembled, built, or grown ourselves.
Because we put the work in.
Exactly. If you go to a high-end furniture store and buy a pre-built desk, it's just a desk. It serves a function. But if you spend 3 agonizing hours on your living room floor,
Hmm?
swearing at a confusing manual, desperately tightening hidden screws with a tiny little hex key to build the exact same desk,
You suddenly love that desk.
you have sweat equity in it. You take immense pride in its stability because you created the stability.
This reflection applies that exact psychological principle to mental and emotional healing. When someone uses a tool on their own terms, it grows with them and becomes more healing, stronger, more supportive as they invest into it.
It is the compounding interest of self-worth. Every small victory belongs entirely to them.
That synthesis, connecting the anonymity of the app with the sweat equity of the plant analogy, is vital to understanding the final piece the author finds.
Because what was realized, forged in the painful fires of a 15-year failure, is that human beings, by our very messy emotional nature, are entirely incapable of offering this specific type of compounding, ego-free growth to another person.
We cannot be the blank slate. We can only ever hand over potted plants.
We can only ever offer pre-digested solutions that carry the heavy weight of our own expectations.
But a tool, whether that is a digital app, a physical journal, or a silent meditation practice engaged with in total solitude, is the soil. It invites the individual to do the digging.
And because they are the ones breaking their backs doing the digging, the roots that grow belong entirely permanently to them.
Something that no human can ever offer.
That is an incredibly heavy conclusion to arrive at.
It is.
To look back at 15 years of giving absolutely everything you have to someone, sacrificing your time, your energy, maybe even parts of your own sanity, only to realize that the very fact that you were human made it fundamentally impossible for you to be the solution they actually needed.
Your humanity was the disqualifying factor.
Which brings us to the most painful, introspective question of this entire journey.
What's that?
If giving people the tools to grow their own plant
Yeah.
and stepping entirely out of the way is the clear, obvious, universally better answer, why did it take the author 15 long, agonizing years to figure this out?
Well, to answer that, we have to follow the author into a space of intense, unflinching self-reflection regarding their own psychological blind spots.
This part is tough to read.
It is. This confession arrives near the very end of the reflection, and it is where the true depth of the narrative cracks wide open. The author didn't spend 15 years doing the wrong thing out of malice or a conscious desire to control or sheer stupidity.
Why did they do it then?
They did it because they were actively projecting their own deepest, most unfulfilled needs onto the person they were trying to save.
The text says we only ever needed safety and support. That line landed like a physical blow.
It really hits hard.
The author writes, and we were willing to find that anywhere, to control the narrative, to try and bring that into every moment.
It is a moment of profound, almost devastating self-awareness. The author finally turns the lens inward and realizes that they personally would have absolutely loved someone to forcefully govern their healing.
Wait, really?
Yeah. If a powerful, loving figure had stepped into the author's life, taken the steering wheel, provided perfect, impenetrable safety, perfect support, and meticulously controlled the narrative of their life to protect them from any harm, it would have been their ultimate fantasy.
Oh, wow.
The text explicitly states, if anyone ever tried to help us the way we tried to help others, it would have been perfect for us.
It is the ultimate tragic failure of the Golden Rule.
Exactly.
From the time we are children, we are taught this fundamental ethical principle: treat others exactly the way you want to be treated. But the author realizes the fatal flaw in that logic when it comes to deep psychological healing.
They took the exact medicine that would have miraculously cured them, and for 15 years, they forcefully shoved it down the throat of someone with a completely different psychological immune system.
Because heavily governed, fiercely protective healing would have worked perfectly for the author, they blindly assumed it was the universal, objective right way to help their partner.
It is the fallacy of universal paths. It's the arrogant assumption that human psychology operates on a single, standardized axis of need.
And they used to deeply believe that providing this overwhelming intervening safety net was the only true manifestation of love.
In fact, they offer a fascinating critique of their own past mindset, using the phrase passive support without teeth.
Yes, I wanted to drill down into that exact phrase, passive support without teeth, because they admit they used to think this kind of support was enough, but eventually realized they were wrong. What exactly do they mean by teeth in this context?
It means they used to believe that simply being a gentle, non-intervening presence, just passively listening, nodding, agreeing, or offering soft platitudes without demanding or driving real action was sufficient.
But they realized it wasn't.
They ultimately realized that true, life-altering support requires the teeth of genuine transformation. It requires friction. It requires accountability.
Okay, that makes sense.
However, the crucial paradigm-shifting pivot is the realization of where those teeth must come from. For 15 years, the author exhausted themselves trying to be the teeth.
They tried to be the driving force.
They tried to be the accountability coach, the one holding the right answer for someone. But the painful realization is that having the objectively right answer is entirely useless if the person doesn't discover it and bite down on it themselves.
The teeth have to belong to the individual doing the healing.
You cannot choose someone else's food for them and expect them to get the nourishment.
When you lay it out like that, it makes you wonder how often we all do this in our daily lives.
No, we do it constantly.
How often do we completely suffocate the people we love because we're relentlessly giving them the exact medicine we secretly wish we were receiving?
We smother an introverted partner with massive surprise parties and constant social stimulation because we desperately wish someone would celebrate us loudly.
Or we give unprompted, hyper-logical, step-by-step advice to a friend who just wants to vent and cry because we personally crave logical solutions to quiet our own internal chaos.
We aren't actually seeing the person in front of us. We are just projecting our own unmet needs onto them like a movie screen.
We project constantly because it is the only psychological framework we have intimate 24/7 access to our own mind.
We assume our internal operating system is the default setting for humanity.
It takes, as the author states, a lot of difficult lessons to understand that our healing path isn't everyone's healing path.
It is incredibly difficult for the human ego to accept that our absolute best intentions, our deepest well of sacrificial love, and our most dedicated, exhausting efforts might actually be toxic.
Or at best, utterly ineffective.
Right, to someone with a different psychological makeup.
Our healing path isn't everyone's healing path. It is such a simple, almost elementary sentence. Yet it took a decade and a half of breaking, failing, and agonizing effort to truly learn its weight.
Which brings us full circle, really.
Back to the very title of this source text, The Gift of What Couldn't Be Fixed.
The synthesis of all these painful, jarring realizations is exactly what transforms the failure into a gift.
So the wave of peace the author feels at the beginning of our discussion, it makes total sense now.
Breaking, failing, and ultimately having to walk away from a 15-year mission wasn't a waste of time. The author doesn't view those 5,400 days with bitterness or regret.
They view them as the necessary, unavoidable crucible.
Without being pushed to the very limit of their sanity, without breaking under the weight of an impossible task, they never would have understood the true, insidious nature of their own ego.
They never would have understood the profound necessity of depersonalized tools.
They never would have recognized the vital, non-negotiable importance of individualized, ungoverned healing. The failure was the only teacher capable of delivering the lesson.
It's the profound gift of limitation. By finally realizing what they inherently couldn't do, they finally understood how the world actually works.
They stopped trying to bend reality to their will.
And I want to ask you, listening right now, to reflect on this in your own life for a moment. Think about the unfixable situations you might be wrestling with right now.
The family member whose destructive choices you are constantly trying to manage and mitigate.
The friend whose recurring crises you spend hours on the phone trying to solve.
The partner whose emotional growth you're secretly, desperately trying to govern.
The core liberating lesson from this deeply personal reflection is that stepping back from those specific governed roles isn't an act of cold abandonment.
Allowing someone to utilize their own tools, to find their own specific path, and to experience the necessary friction of their own growth is the ultimate act of love.
It is the act of removing your ego from their journey.
It is returning their sovereign agency. It is putting down the heavy, fully grown potted plant you've been trying to force them to hold and simply handing them a seed.
Exactly. It's having the courage to step out of the passenger seat, let them take the steering wheel, and let them drive, even if you know they might hit a few bumps along the way.
Because at the end of the day, it's their car.
And that leads me to one final lingering thought inspired by this incredible journey. A question I want you to sit with and mull over long after we wrap up today. If we truly deeply accept this premise, if we accept that we fundamentally cannot govern someone else's healing, What happens to all of that incredible energy, that fierce love, and that relentless daily effort we've been pouring into trying to fix them?
That's a profound question.
When you finally stop exhausting yourself trying to maintain a massive overgrown plant in someone else's garden, what could you finally grow in your own?